personal journal written by the prophet Jeremiah as he saw everything he knew come to an end. The city of God, Jerusalem, the place of his chosen people, the place where God would abide at the temple, gone at the hands of the Babylonians. The enemy had come in and had destroyed the city. And we're going to see in the book of Lamentations that he has penned his thoughts and what he saw and felt that horrible day when everything was forever changed. Lamentations is a difficult book. It's not one you want to sit down to relax and read. It's hard. In a sense today, as we study this book, it's as though we are attending the funeral of the city of Jerusalem. There are only two bright spots in the book. One is the hope that we find in chapter 3, and the other is the color of the suit that I'm wearing today. Lamentations means to cry aloud, to wail in grief. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet or the suffering prophet or the lonely prophet. And he was known for that because, you remember, he was commanded not to marry. And so he was lonely. And he suffered greatly. He has been prophesying to these people for 40 years. And they have paid no attention to him. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine telling people truth and warning them, and they do not listen? The warnings were refused, and listen to this, they were refused even after these people had seen the devastation that has taken place in Israel, the northern kingdom. The Assyrians have come down and harshly treated them and taken them away or killed them. This is really close to home. But even so, they are basically saying, it won't happen to us because we're God's chosen people. We have the temple here. God will never, ever let this happen. And yet, it does. You know, so many people today believe that God is only a God of love, that there is no judgment. And so they choose many times to study the New Testament in place of the Old Testament because they don't like that judgment stuff. They want to read about Jesus and Jesus being about love. And he is, of course. But you make a huge mistake if you think that there is no judgment in the New Testament. You need to read from Acts chapter 5 and see God's immediate judgment on Ananias and Sapphira when they sinned. And also, I wanted to read to you from Hebrews chapter 10, and it says, "It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God," and some translations say, of an angry God. There is judgment in the New Testament as well, because God is the perfect parent. He's not an indulgent parent. Surely you and I, as parents, when we warn our children about consequences and they disobey us anyway, we follow through, don't we, with those promises of discipline. God does the same thing, but he's far more patient than we are. He's waited years and years and years, but they have refused every prophet's words. Now, the first thing we're going to see in our study is that Jeremiah describes Jerusalem's desolation. And then we're going to see that the city is deserted by its inhabitants and former friends. Notice the word former friends. We pick up in chapter 1 and we see that the city was once crowded, but now it's as lonely as a widow. And it was once beheld as a princess, but now is mocked. People are mocking it, and the people, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, are carried off and are enslaved. Gone are the former comforters and lovers and friends. They've now become the enemy. Gone are the feasts and the festivals that they loved so much. The roads were at one time full of pilgrims coming into Jerusalem, but no more. The roads are empty because there is no one coming and there are no festivals. The city has been cut off and it has been surrounded for a long period of time. Gone is the majesty and the royalty that was once there. Even the army has fled. None of them are left. God's city that was so esteemed is now laughed at. The enemy is glad. The former friends think it's funny, and they are enjoying the misery of Jerusalem. What a sad thing. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? We're told because Israel sinned and because they forgot to consider the future. Look with me at verse 9 of chapter 1. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She did not consider her future. Therefore she has fallen astonishingly. She has no comforter. That's what happens so many times. We don't consider the future because we think nothing will ever change. We think it'll stay just as it is. And we're really happy with that. And we never think beyond that. That's what happened to Israel. They always thought, it won't happen to us. We find that heathens are in the temple. The people come in that are the unclean, that God had commanded that they never be in there, and here they are, trampling through it. Gone are the once precious things, those things that they had to have. You know, that stuff that we have to have, and it's so important and we stock it up. Now it's gone, and you know why? Because they've had to sell it. They've had to sell all of it in order to eat, because the city's been cut off and there is no food. The city is devastated. Nothing is as it was. There's no comfort. The following verses, 12 through 22, are given from the city's perspective, are given from Jerusalem's perspective. And Jerusalem is really in anguish and crying out to God in her misery and in her desolation. Look at verse 12, if you will. Is it nothing to all of you who pass this way? Look and see if there is any pain like my pain, which was severely dealt out to me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. They know it's from the Lord. They realize now that they did not obey him. And they're crying out and they're saying, don't you see my pain? Don't you care? Doesn't anybody care? And nobody does. Nobody cares. And the city sees that it's too late. But now they see their sin. But it's too late for them to do anything about it. They've had all this opportunity. And God has finally brought his wrath. They see not only the city's sin, but they see the betrayal of their one-time friends. And it's hard to take in. It's hard to look at. And the lesson here is that forgetting to consider the future does not eliminate its consequences. Forgetting to consider the future does not eliminate its consequences. That's no excuse. And in chapter 2, Jeremiah describes Jerusalem's destruction. As a judgment, the Lord destroyed the city in anger. We see in chapter 2 what God is doing. It says in verse 1, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. Look down to 2. The Lord has swallowed up. He has not spared. Look at verse 3. In fierce anger, he has cut off all the strength of Israel. He has drawn back his right hand. This has to be the hardest thing of all because God has removed his protection. You see, we don't realize how protected we are until it's no longer there. And God has just taken his hand and removed it. And basically he has just said, come what may. I'll let the enemy come in. I'm not going to interfere. And so God took away his hand. He abandoned the temple. They thought this would never happen. You know, God's presence was in the temple, but no longer is it there. And he silenced the prophets and the elders so that there is no word and there is no guidance from God whatsoever. That has to be the worst, to be left totally on our own, totally alone. And then Jeremiah delivered a message of blame to Jerusalem's unfaithful. Now, Jeremiah is hurt because of all the suffering that he's seeing, but he's primarily discouraged and hurt because of what he's seeing happening to the children. The children are deprived of food because the powers that be keep it for themselves. Jeremiah blames the false prophets for leading the people astray, but he also blames those who listen to them. And then Jerusalem is reminded of the judgment prophecies in past history. You will be astounded if you will go and look in Deuteronomy chapter 28, and you will see the verses of prophecy that were given to Moses by God of what would happen to these people if they disobeyed God. The astounding thing is that you can match those verses in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy almost word for word with the fulfilled prophecy, this judgment that comes upon these people in the book of Lamentation. It makes chills go up your spine. Given thousands of years before, but now coming true almost to the letter. There is a lesson here, and that is that disobedience to the Lord guarantees consequences from the Lord. Our disobedience to the Lord guarantees consequences from Him. Jerusalem, in chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, experiences horrid atrocities. This is really difficult to read. There is no rest, there is no relief, and there is starvation in the city. And apparently, when there's starvation, the desire to live and survive kicks in such a way that the unthinkable happens. We're told, as hard as this is, especially for women, I think, to hear, that mothers were so hungry that they were boiling their children and eating them. There was cannibalism in the city of Jerusalem. God's priests and prophets were killed. The young and the old, it made no difference, were struck down in the streets. They'd just as soon kill a child as kill an old woman or an old man. No one escaped. It was a horrible time. The lesson is that God's word will come to pass sooner or later. God's word will come to pass. He is faithful and He does what He says. In chapter 3, Jeremiah describes his despair. This makes this book really personal, and I hope you relate to some of this. Jeremiah voices feelings of personal depression at what he sees. Sometimes we're horrified to think that a Christian would be depressed. How could that be? And we cover it up because it's not something we want to talk about. But I'm here to tell you that depression happens to Christians as well as it does to others. Sometimes our circumstances are almost beyond what we can handle. And we feel just like Jeremiah did. And I want us to see what he has to say because I think we can really relate to this. First of all, he is in physical misery and he is starving. And he is hiding in dark places. At one point during the siege of Jerusalem, you've already heard, he was thrown into a cistern. And he was really left there to die, except God intervened.